Emily moved swiftly between tables, refilling coffee cups and taking orders as the late afternoon rush filled the diner. She loved her job, even on the busiest days. The scent of sizzling burgers and fresh coffee filled the air, blending with the soft hum of conversation. Just as she was about to grab a tray from the counter, the front door chimed. She glanced up and saw a man step inside, accompanied by a well-trained Labrador retriever in a service vest. The man, a broad-shouldered veteran with a quiet, steady presence, walked with purpose, his dog alert at his side. Emily smiled warmly. "Welcome in, sit anywhere you like." The veteran, Jake, gave a small nod and guided his dog to a booth near the window. Max, his service dog, sat obediently at his feet. As Emily reached for her notepad, she noticed her manager, Mr. Collins, glaring from behind the counter. His lips pressed into a thin line as he stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," Mr. Collins said sharply, striding over. "We don't allow pets in here." Jake calmly met his gaze. "Max isn't a pet, he's my service dog." Emily felt her stomach tighten. She had seen this scenario before. Some people just didn't understand the law when it came to service animals. She quickly interjected, "Actually, Mr. Collins, service dogs are protected under federal law. He's allowed to be here." Mr. Collins barely glanced at her, his focus locked on Jake. "I don't care what kind of dog it is. Health code says no animals. You'll have to leave." Jake clenched his jaw, remaining composed. "With all due respect, sir, that's not how the law works." Emily could see the tension rising. Other customers had begun to take notice, a few pausing their conversations to glance over. She knew what was right, and she wasn't about to let this slide. "Mr. Collins, the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically allows service animals in public places, including restaurants," she said firmly. "This is illegal discrimination." Her manager turned to her, eyes flashing with irritation. "Stay out of this, Emily. This isn't your concern." "It is my concern," she shot back, "because I work here, and I won't stand by and watch you kick out someone who has every right to be here." A tense silence hung between them. Jake remained still, his grip tightening on Max's leash. Mr. Collins exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's it. I've had enough of your backtalk. You're fired." The words hit Emily like a slap. Fired, just like that. She blinked, stunned, but quickly recovered. She looked around at the customers, watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable. Others whispered among themselves. Emily slowly pulled off her apron, folded it, and set it on the counter. "If standing up for what's right costs me my job, so be it." She turned to Jake, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm sorry about this." Jake met her eyes with quiet gratitude. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she replied simply. Without another word, she grabbed her bag and walked out, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Collins stood there, arms crossed, watching her leave with smug satisfaction. But what he didn't know was that his actions had just set off a chain reaction he never could have expected. Emily stepped outside into the crisp evening air, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The shock of losing her job still hadn't fully settled in, but she refused to regret her decision. She had done what was right. That mattered more than a paycheck. Still, the weight of reality pressed against her as she sat down on the curb, resting her arms on her knees. A few minutes later, the diner door swung open, and Jake stepped out with Max trotting obediently beside him. The veteran approached slowly, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, studying her. "You okay?" he asked. Emily forced a small smile. "I will be. Just wasn't expecting to get fired over common decency." Jake nodded as if he understood all too well. He shifted his stance, glancing back at the diner. Through the window, Mr. Collins was still at the counter chatting with another employee like nothing had happened. The tension in Jake's shoulders was evident. "I'm sorry," Jake said after a moment. "You didn't have to stand up for me." "Yes, I did," Emily replied, looking up at him. "People like Mr. Collins think they can get away with treating people unfairly because no one calls them out. If no one ever stands up, nothing changes." Jake exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Not many people would have done what you did. Well, not many people have the courage to serve their country either, she said. I think you've done your share of standing up for others. A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of Jake's lips. He sat down on the curb beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. Max settled at his feet, his large brown eyes scanning the street, ever alert. "You're not going back in there?" Emily asked, nodding toward the diner. Jake shook his head. "Not after that. I've had worse happen, but there's no reason to support a place that treats people like that." Emily sighed. "Yeah, I'm just worried about my rent now. I don't have much saved up." Jake studied her for a moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, neatly folded bill. "Here." Emily recoiled slightly, shaking her head. No way. I didn't do this expecting anything in return." "I know," Jake said simply. "That's exactly why you deserve it." She hesitated before gently pushing his hand away. "I'll figure something out." A brief silence passed between them, the sound of passing cars and faint conversations from inside the diner filled the space. A few tables away, a group of older men in worn leather jackets and baseball caps watched the scene unfold. Their eyes flicked from Emily to Jake, then back to the diner. One of them, a grizzled man with a white beard and an old Marine Corps cap, leaned forward and muttered something to the others. A moment later, he reached for his phone and made a call. Jake didn't seem to notice, but Emily caught the motion out of the corner of her eye. The way they whispered, the glances they exchanged, it felt like something was brewing. "Looks like you have a few people on your side," she murmured, nodding toward the veterans. Jake followed her gaze, giving a slight nod of recognition. "Yeah, a lot of guys from the service hang around here." As if on cue, the old man put down his phone and gave a slow, knowing smile. Emily didn't know what he had just set in motion, but she had a feeling things weren't over yet. She looked back at Jake and Max. "You ever feel like life throws curveballs just to test if you're paying attention?" Jake chuckled. "More times than I can count." Emily exhaled, shaking off the last of her frustration. "Guess we'll see what happens next." Neither of them could have predicted what was coming. The low rumble of approaching vehicles sent a ripple of curiosity through the diner's patrons. The headlights of several large, dark-colored SUVs cut through the dimming evening light as they pulled up in front of the diner. The convoy came to a halt with an air of quiet authority, and the doors swung open almost simultaneously. Stepping out first was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp Marine Corps uniform, his posture commanding instant respect. His name tag gleamed under the neon glow of the diner sign, but the only thing more striking than his presence was the row of medals pinned to his chest. Behind him, several other uniformed men followed, their gazes sharp and focused as they took in their surroundings. Inside the diner, the chatter died instantly. Forks paused mid-air. Customers glanced at one another, confusion and anticipation flickering in their eyes. Mr. Collins, who had been recounting the earlier incident to another employee with a smug grin, faltered as he caught sight of the scene unfolding outside. Emily, still sitting on the curb with Jake and Max, turned her head at the sound of approaching boots on pavement. Her brows furrowed slightly as she took in the sight of the Marine officer striding toward them with a purpose. Jake exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. "Well, that's unexpected." Emily looked over at him. "You know them?" Before he could answer, the officer came to a stop just a few feet away, his gaze locking onto Jake's. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, then a slow nod of recognition. "Sergeant Jacob Reed." The officer's voice was even, but there was something beneath it, respect, familiarity. "Didn't expect to find you out here like this." Jake stood, giving a respectful nod. "Neither did I, sir." The officer's sharp eyes flicked briefly to Max, before shifting to Emily, his expression unreadable. He turned his attention back to Jake. "I got a call about a veteran being disrespected in this establishment. Thought I'd come see for myself." At that moment, the diner door creaked open, and Mr. Collins stepped outside. His face was a shade paler than before, his confidence visibly shaken as he took in the scene. The sight of the Marine officer and the uniformed men flanking him had clearly struck a nerve. Can I help you, gentlemen?" Mr. Collins asked, his voice carrying a forced politeness. The officer slowly turned his head toward him, his gaze piercing. "Are you the manager of this establishment?" Mr. Collins cleared his throat, straightening his posture. "Yes, I am." The officer took a single step closer, and the weight of his presence alone seemed to push Mr. Collins back a fraction. "Then you're the one who refused service to a decorated Marine and his service dog." A few nearby customers gasped quietly, and murmurs spread through the growing crowd of onlookers. Some of the veterans who had been sitting outside now stood with their arms crossed, watching intently. Mr. Collins opened his mouth, then hesitated. His eyes darted between the officer and Jake before he forced out a tight chuckle. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I wasn't—" "No misunderstanding," the officer cut him off, his voice firm. "You denied service to a veteran and violated federal law in the process. And worse, you fired someone for standing up for what was right." Mr. Collins swallowed hard. His previous arrogance was slipping rapidly. "Now listen, I was just following health regulations." "Save it," the officer said sharply. "I've already made some calls. If I wanted to, I could have this place shut down for what you've done." Mr. Collins's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His usual dominance over his employees was nowhere to be found. Emily watched the exchange, barely able to suppress the satisfaction rising in her chest. She had never seen Mr. Collins look anything less than completely in control. Until now. The officer took a step back and turned to Emily. "Miss, you're the one who stood up for Sergeant Reed." She nodded. "Yes, sir." The officer studied her for a brief moment before offering a small nod of approval. That took courage. Emily wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply nodded in return. Turning back to Jake, the officer's expression softened ever so slightly. "You didn't deserve this, Sergeant. We take care of our own." Jake inclined his head in appreciation. "I know, sir." The officer exhaled, then gave Mr. Collins one final lingering look. "I suggest you think long and hard about the kind of business you're running here." With that, he turned and motioned to his men. As they moved back toward their vehicles, the tension in the air slowly began to fade. But Mr. Collins remained frozen in place, his mind clearly racing. Emily exchanged a glance with Jake. The shift in power had been swift, undeniable. Whatever was about to happen next, Mr. Collins would never look at his employees or his customers the same way again. The heavy silence that followed the Marine officer's departure hung over the diner like an unshakable weight. Mr. Collins stood motionless, his face pale, his once smug demeanor completely shattered. He glanced around at the customers still seated inside, their eyes locked on him, with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no escaping it. Emily remained outside with Jake and Max, watching as people inside the diner began murmuring among themselves. A few customers shook their heads in disapproval, some muttering under their breath as they reached for their wallets. Then, one by one, they began standing up. A man in a suit, who had been sitting near the counter, tossed a few bills onto his table before heading for the door. As he passed Mr. Collins, he shot him a look of disdain. "I won't be eating here again," he said coldly before walking out. A woman with her 2 young kids followed, her gaze sharp. "If this is how you treat people, you don't deserve my business," she said as she walked past. More followed suit. A group of college students at a corner booth whispered among themselves before standing up together and leaving without another word. An elderly couple who had been quietly eating their pie slowly rose and made their way toward the door, shaking their heads as they exited. Within minutes, nearly half the diner had emptied. The sound of the cash register barely rang anymore. The once lively hum of conversation had turned into an awkward, stifling quiet. The remaining customers exchanged glances, some still processing what had just happened. Emily watched it unfold, her heart pounding. She had never imagined the community would take a stand like this. She had expected to be just another fired employee, forgotten by the next day. But this was something different. Mr. Collins finally found his voice, though it was weaker than before. "Wait, hold on! This is ridiculous!" He stepped forward, his hands raised as if to calm the crowd. But no one was listening. The bearded veteran from earlier, the one who had made the phone call, was the last to leave. He stopped just before stepping outside, turning back to Mr. Collins with a smirk. "Actions have consequences," he said, before walking out and letting the door swing shut behind him. The bell above the door jingled one last time, then silence settled over the nearly empty diner. Emily exhaled slowly, turning back to Jake. He gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "You made an impact," he said. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I wasn't trying to. I just didn't want to stand by and watch something wrong happen." Jake looked down at Max, then back at Emily. "That's exactly why it matters." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps approached. Emily turned and found herself face to face with the Marine officer who had lingered nearby, observing the fallout. His expression was thoughtful, his gaze steady. "You don't have a job anymore, do you?" he asked. Emily let out a small, breathy laugh. "Not anymore." The officer nodded, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a neatly folded business card. "We could use someone like you at the base canteen, someone who stands up for what's right." He extended the card toward her. "If you're interested, give me a call." Emily blinked, momentarily stunned. "You're serious?" "As serious as it gets," he replied. She hesitated for only a moment before taking the card, glancing down at the crisp lettering. The name, the official title, the contact information. It was real. A genuine smile spread across her face. "Thank you, I'll think about it." Jake clapped her on the shoulder. "Looks like you landed on your feet." Emily exhaled, feeling a rush of relief she hadn't expected. Maybe losing her job hadn't been the worst thing that could have happened. Maybe, in a strange way, it had led her exactly where she needed to be. She turned toward the now quiet diner, where Mr. Collins stood behind the counter, staring at the nearly deserted room, his face twisted in disbelief. He had spent years believing he could treat people however he wanted, that his power as the manager was absolute. But tonight, he had learned a lesson the hard way. Emily turned back to Jake and the officer, tucking the business card into her pocket. "Looks like things worked out after all." Jake smirked. "Funny how life does that." Max wagged his tail, nudging Jake's leg as if sensing the shift in the air. The three of them stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle in. Then, with a newfound sense of purpose, Emily straightened her shoulders and took a step forward, ready to embrace whatever came next.